We're off. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions have been put on hold for a bit, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster, intriguing interviews with creative minds. With us tonight is the international best-selling science fiction and fantasy author, Kevin J. Anderson. With more than 150 books, comic books, and games, he has written for Star Wars, Dune, X-Files, Batman, and Superman, and various original series, including Saga of the Seven Sons, Terra Incognita, and Saga of Shadows. Welcome, Kevin.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Glad to be here.
No, great to have you. Thanks so much. For a quick heads up to the folks at home, feel free to send me notes or questions you have for Kevin in the chat box, and we'll get to some at the end of the show. All right, so as we always do, let's jump in. So Kevin, tell me, where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
I was born in Racine, Wisconsin, and I grew up in this little tiny town called Franksville, Wisconsin. It had population 250 people, and the only industry in town was the sauerkraut factory. And so we grew up smelling the sauerkraut factory all year long, cranking out fermented cabbage, and all the farmers for miles around grew cabbage, and we'd watch trucks roll by filled with cabbage heads, and we had the sauerkraut festival every summer. And you know, I basically grew up in a sort of a Norman Rockwell painting is what it looked. I mean, this was very, very Midwestern, very white, very Protestant, very Ray Bradbury, Norman Rockwell, everything. And I like to say that, you know, growing up, I kind of was listening to my little transistor radio. That's how long ago, like 60s. And, you know, we didn't have a record store. We didn't have a bookstore. We got everything sort of by mail. And like once or twice a year, we'd drive into Milwaukee and to the big city. And so I kind of grew up isolated, and all I had to do was read books and read comics and make up my own imaginary stories.
So was it just you? Do you have brothers, sisters?
I have one sister. So it was my parents. My dad was a bank president. My mom was an accountant and a housewife. And I had a little sister, and we were polar opposites. I mean, she didn't like to read. She didn't like to imagine things. And I was the nerdy kid with the bad haircut and hand-me-down clothes and glasses. And, you know, basically this guy will never, ever have a girlfriend kind of thing. And that's kind of when that's how I got into the rock band Rush and other progressive rock. I mean, Kansas and Styx and Alan Parsons Project and all this stuff.
Right.
We got, like I said, we didn't have a record store, but we'd always get these junk mailers for join the Columbia Record Club. You get 13 albums for $1 if you join the record club. Yep. And they had this sheet of little postage stamps, and each stamp had an album cover on it. And you would like peel off the stamps and figure out which albums that you wanted. And because I was, you know, ninth grade or something is sort of when you get turned on to music, especially the music that will annoy your parents. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at all this stuff, and I picked, I mean, the sheet for the Columbia Record Club had like Alan Parsons Project, I, Robot, and Kansas Point of No Return, and Rush 2112. And I just went, these all look like science fiction. So I picked all of those and listened to them. And I got to tell you, Geddy Lee's voice and Alex Lifeson's guitars and Neil Peart's drums is exactly the kind of stuff that annoyed my country and Western parents. So,
oh, interesting. So wait, that's an interesting kind of concept. So it's sort of, so the rock music was one part of it, but the artwork had its own kind of, you know, sci-fi aesthetic to it, and the two of them kind of seemed, so that was a blend for you then, right? Yes.
Well, you know, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will like picture in your head the cover of Kansas Point of No Return. It's this ship sailing off the edge of the earth with sea monsters coming up. Right. And Rush 2112 is this giant red star with neon lights on it. And you know, Alan Parsons Project, I, Robot, all of these things. And you're just seeing them on the stamps and I didn't know any of these albums. All I heard was like the Casey Kasem's American Top 40, and they didn't play Rush 2112 on Casey Kasem's American Top 40. And so I just thought, I just wanted to get anything that had a science fiction bent to it. And, you know, like I said, I was skinny kid. I was a nerd. I had like no fashion sense. I didn't know how to talk to girls. And so all the normal top 40 songs about, oh, baby, baby, and my girlfriend left me. It's like none of that meant anything to me because I wasn't going to get a girlfriend anyway. So, I mean, I'd rather listen to, sailing ships and Sticks, Come Sail Away, the guy out on the boat and then the UFO shows up. And I mean, these are the kind of songs that inspired my imagination. And, I was already writing my own stories, but listening to the music really kind of connected. It was like a soundtrack to the stories that I was thinking of. And I mean, I got all the Rush albums, some of the really early Rush albums, The Caress of Steel and Fly By Night and things like that. They're these big epic, the Fountain of Lamneth and the Necromancer and Vitor and the Snow Dog and all these. I mean, these aren't love songs. These are big fantasy novels set to music, basically.
Right. So I have to add, just because you're on that thread, I just have to ask if this is just a spur of the moment question. So, of the times, maybe a little bit past that, early 80s, you get the Flash Gordon movie that kind of had that,
Queen.
Right, with the Queen soundtrack. I mean, what a cheeseball movie, but man, was that fun stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, I went to see it in the theater, and in fact, I went with one of my friends from high school, and when we went to see it, it's like every person in line was like this little 8-year-old and 10-year-old with their mom, right. And then there was like us two tall teenage guys, and then a bunch of other little kids, and it was such a campy and ridiculous movie, but I still remember it. Timothy Dalton was in that. And,
sure was. Yeah.
Ming the Max von Sydow was Ming the Merciless. It was like perfect. And
yeah. So let me ask you. So the music that you chose to annoy your parents, did it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just cranking Cygnus X1 for the guys get sucked down into a black hole and ends up in another universe where the Greek gods have gone to live. This is just like screaming. Now Geddy Lee's voice is already, I mean, it's so much better in the later ones, but the early Geddy Lee was way high pitched and wailing and exactly the kind of stuff that set my parents. So they turned that music down and
so they obviously, your parents being both in the finance sector of sorts, which is it's almost by its very nature, it's kind of a very conservative kind of industry. And you're, like you said, you're in your sci-fi, nerdy rebellion kind of piece. Did they, despite, those differences, did they encourage your love for sci-fi and fantasy in your writing? Or was it just something that they just sort of said, well, they just kind of just said, all right, whatever, just go do whatever you do? Well,
see, the thing was, I was a pretty good kid anyway. I always got good grades, and I wasn't a rebel, and I didn't go and get arrested for stuff. And so they kind of knew that I was an okay kid, and they indulged what I wanted to do. But before I went to college, they made me promise to them that I would not major in English and creative writing because, I had to major in something where I could get a job, because you can never earn a living by being a writer. So I promised I didn't do it. So I went and majored in astronomy with a minor in Russian history.
Oh, jeez.
Not like you could get a job with either of that anyway, but
unless you want to be a Russian astronomer, then.
Well, it turned out, and I wanted to be a writer, so I was. This was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so it's a Big Ten school and great university. And I lived at home because we lived just 20 minutes south of Madison, and ironically, I wanted to be a writer. So all the time while I was taking my classes, I was like publishing short stories in little magazines, and I got articles published in places. And ironically, I wanted to get a job that had something to do with writing, because that was my real love. And with my science degree, I applied for technical writing jobs all over the place. And I got a couple of interviews, and I got flown out to California, where they interviewed me to be a technical writer for the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is giant government research laboratory. And I remember interviewing with those people, and they said, this we rarely see somebody that's so uniquely and perfectly qualified. You've got writing experience and writing credits. You've got the background in physics and astronomy, so the science, and you've got a minor in Russian history. And this was a nuclear weapons design lab during the Cold War against the Soviets. So this was like, you just check all the boxes, and they hired me. They made me a job offer right there on the spot with a starting salary that was more than my dad was making as a bank president. So, so serendipity was I got exactly the right kind of skills, and then I got to do my own. I mean, I kept writing science fiction in the evenings and weekends, but during the day I was writing like chemical protective clothing handbooks and respirator safety manuals and laser guide
today, right? Wow.
Yeah. So, you know, but I was making my living by writing, and that was the cool thing to me.
So let me ask, so how did you make that transition from, obviously you've kind of had a really kind of a fascinating twist and turn. So how did you go from being this, you know, borderline, you know, astrophysicist, chemical writer to becoming what you are now? What was the first real transition where you said, okay, this could be a thing for me?
Well, I mean, that was, to me, everything was always based on someday I'm going to be able to make a living as a writer. I mean, I believed it if nobody else did. And I just kept sending stories around, and finally in like 1986 or something like that, I decided it was time to write my first novel. And I wrote, I had in my head this idea for this like hard science fiction, gothic horror murder mystery about a kind of a weird mashup. But the thing was, it's in a future where instead of building robots to do all the dirty work, we've got the human body here, that it's like the perfect machine. And that even when somebody dies, the machine is still there. So I had people jump starting dead bodies to sort of be like high-tech zombies as servants. I mean, they were technologically jump started. And so these servants were the ones that were brought back to life. So they would like handle the chemical waste dumps and dig ditches and all the menial labor. And my story's about a guy, he's murdered on page 1. He's found murdered, and he's brought back as a servant unwittingly to serve the guy who murdered him, and he starts getting flashbacks. So cool. It's kind of this cool thing. And as I'm making up this idea and I'm kind of outlining and developing it, Rush, one of my absolute favorite bands, comes out with a brand new album called Grace Under Pressure. And it's like this science fiction concept album, and all the songs on this Grace Under Pressure album, it's like every song on there matches a scene or a chapter that I was writing for my first novel, which is called Resurrection Inc. And I just thought, this is cool. And I listened to that album over and over again. And I made sure that I kind of did Easter eggs and little snippets of lyrics. And I built my whole novel around that album. And my agent actually sold it to Signet Books, which is a major paperback publisher. They were Stephen King's publisher for a long time. And when the book was published, I put in the acknowledgments page that this novel was inspired by the haunting album Grace Under Pressure, and special thanks to Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart. And when the book was published, I got 3 copies of it, and I signed one to each of the 3 guys from Rush, and I mailed it off to Mercury Records. So it's basically, put it in a package and mail it off. And I assume it kind of went into the warehouse where the Ark of the Covenant is kept or something.
Right.
And about a year and a half later, I came home from work one day, and in my mailbox, there was a letter with a Canadian stamp in it. And the return address was Neil Peart.
Oh,
and
get
he
out.
had written me a 4-page fan letter on Resurrection Inc. He got it and he read it, and he loved it, and he invited me to keep corresponding with him. And
wow.
we ended up being friends for 32 years before he just passed away in January. So
wow. Wow.
So that's one of those twists and turns that you were talking about. I mean, that's
wow. Okay, I want to talk more about that, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to cover some other stuff first. So you are really into Dune.
Okay. Well, I hope so. I co-write the books with Frank Herbert's son. So
okay. So first of all, are you looking forward to the new movies?
Absolutely. I was a creative consultant. I worked on it. Brian Herbert, my co-author, is also working very closely. He's a something, executive producer. I don't know what all these Hollywood terms mean, but we both worked on the movie and read the scripts and seen stuff, and we love what we're seeing. And we just found out a couple of days ago that the release date, which should have been this December, has been postponed till next October, which is disappointing, but probably not surprising to anybody. So I'm loving what I'm seeing. The trailer just dropped a few weeks ago, and in the very first week, 25 million people viewed the trailer.
It looks amazing.
That's a good sign. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, the director's fantastic. He's done some great stuff already.
Well, I love Blade Runner 2049. Was just like an amazing movie, and he's a huge Dune fan, so I have high hopes.
So did they really? Obviously it's a complex world. Do you feel that they really captured not just the spirit but the story as well?
Well, it felt very close, and they're very strict on what they let me say in public because they have their own press release people. I just want to smile and say I'm very pleased with what I've seen so far. So.
All right, fair enough. So look, Dune and Star Wars are very different universes. What's the appeal for you to write in each, and what does one allow you to do as a writer that maybe the other one doesn't? Or what do you get out of one? What do you get out of them? They're not the same. So what do you think?
Well, they're actually not that different. They both fall into like the giant canvas epic science fiction category.
True.
Lots of planets, lots of spaceships, lots of opportunities for multiple characters and multiple storylines and things. Dune has a whole lot more politics in it. Star Wars has a whole lot more aliens in it. One would say that aliens and politics are tend to be connected anyway, but
yes.
I mean, in Dune, there are no aliens. It's humans are the only thing. Now they're sandworms and stuff like that, but there are no Martians and no Klingons and no other alien races. But the depth and intricacy of all of the underpinnings in Dune, all of the ecology and philosophy and just the awareness of so many different interconnected things makes it a huge challenge to write, which is why I'm glad I've got Brian Herbert. So that the two of us together can try to build up at least part of what Frank Herbert did all by himself. Star Wars is more colorful and popular. There's more humor in it. There's more amazing aliens. I mean, you can come up with the craziest alien races, and of course you've got the big evil empire and the good rebels, and that's a whole different thing. I really kind of like both of them. I mean, obviously I've done 15 Dune novels and a total of I think 54 Lucasfilm projects over the years. When you count the comics and pop-up books and everything. But Star Wars was, as I told you before, being the nerdy kid, I'm a fanboy to the core. I mean, I grew up being a fanboy. I grew up watching Lost in Space, and I grew up running home from high school every day to watch classic Star Trek, which was on at 3:30 every afternoon. So I got to watch every episode. And I'm going to sound like an old fart here, but these kids today just don't understand how hard you can watch anything you want whenever right now.
Right.
But we could only watch Star Trek at 3:30 in the afternoon, and we could only watch the episode that was being broadcast that day. And if we happened to miss our favorite episode, like The Trouble with Tribbles was on, and I had to stay after school for something and I missed it, I wasn't going to get a chance to see that again for 9 months or however long it took for them to cycle around the rerun.
Right.
Scene.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Now we sort of have instant access to everything, and which I'm not complaining about. I think it's terrific, especially being stuck home in the pandemic. My wife and I are just binging through shows like crazy. And
what are you watching?
Right now we're watching this Australian women's prison drama called Wentworth. It's kind of like Orange is the New Black, which we also did a few years ago, but this one's 8 seasons long, and we're just kind of plowing through it, and I've made up my mind, deciding that I don't ever want to be sent to an Australian women's prison.
Okay,
So I
that's
hope
not a
that's not going
sentence
to
I ever
happen.
thought I'd hear
I hope
someone
that's
say
not
out
going to
loud.
happen anyway. But so we did that. We did This Is Us from start to finish, which we had never watched before.
Yep.
I really, it's not so much science fiction shows for me. It's well written shows.
Mm,
I mean, I have little patience for badly written, badly done shows
mm,
because I'm a writer. It's sort of like I'm a surgeon looking at something, and if they do a sloppy job, you don't want to see it.
right.
And so I really admire the very well written shows.
All right, so I want to shift a little bit. So the X-Files is a very different kind of sci-fi and even dabbles in some horror. What do you enjoy most about X-Files?
Well, like I said, I consider science fiction, fantasy, horror, everything was like the stuff that I read. And I grew up reading Ray Bradbury, who wrote science fiction, fantasy, and horror all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And the X-Files, they came to me. I mean, Chris Carter, the creator of the X-Files, had read some of my Star Wars books, and he asked if I would write X-Files books for him. And I was a big fan of the show. I'd already watched it, and I loved the old the Night Stalker show,
Right.
and I loved the Twilight Zone, all kinds of stuff like that. And getting that opportunity, when you understand about creating suspense and writing a suspense scene or a chase scene or a mystery, those kind of skills can be used in every kind of writing. I mean, if you know how to write a really tense and scary scene for an X-Files, you can write a really tense and scary scene in a Star Wars book, because those skills transfer. And you also need to study romance so that you get a romance correct. And us nerdy kids didn't have all that much experience in it, so it always never knew how to do that.
So Mulder and Scully, on screen for sure have a very specific relationship. It's got a lot of layers to it, and they're very, they have very distinct personalities. When you were writing X-Files, did you hear, the actors' voices in your head, or did you kind of have to make it your own?
No. I had to hear them in my head. So when I do stuff like this, like with Star Wars, I watch those movies over and over and over and over and over again. And you get to the point where you can just hear everything in your head, hear the way the characters talk. Like, I know exactly how Luke Skywalker sounds. I know exactly how Han Solo sounds. And the same thing with the X-Files, you know exactly how Mulder and Scully sound.
For
and
sure.
when I came into writing the books, I think we had just finished the second season. And the second season, I think, was the best one. That was when they kind of really perfected their model, and all the characters got into their routine. So I kind of jumped in at the best time
Cool.
to be writing my stuff. And I wrote 3 X-Files novels. Each one was, a standalone X-Files episode. And Chris Carter told me, this was really interesting, because I was asking him, what do you want me to write for the X-Files? And he said something I'll never forget. He said, Kevin, you're a writer. When you're writing a novel, you have an unlimited special effects budget. You can write the biggest story, the most complex scenes. You can put in aliens. You can go to all sorts of these locales that we could never afford to do for a weekly episode.
Right.
So, turn loose, do whatever you can, make an X-Files story that we could never afford to do as an episode.
Oh, cool.
I love that advice. I love the writers have an unlimited special effects budget.
Right on. Okay, so we talked about at the beginning of the show, music is obviously a big part of your life, and you have this really fascinating relationship both with Rush and then, of course, with Neil Peart, who is arguably the greatest drummer in rock history, and if not,
well, there's no argument to that.
Okay, fair enough. You would get none from me. So you've got a new book called Drum Beats, which is a collaboration with Neil Peart.
Yeah, right.
So talk to me about that. How did that come to? What's it about, and how did it come to be?
Well, so back when we were becoming closer and closer friends, like Neil was reading a bunch of my books, and at the time he would do these wonderful trips. He was he would bicycle around Africa. He'd fly over there with his bicycle, and he'd just go to the wildest regions of Africa and visit these villages and go all over the place. And he'd write me these like 8-page letters describing everything that he did. And he's a great writer with all this sensory details and characters that he met and all kinds of things. And I got asked to write a story for an anthology called Shock Rock, which is basically rock music connected horror stories. And so I thought, well, why don't I see if Neil will write a story with me? Because what could be more perfect for the anthology than to have a story written by me and Neil, the drummer from Rush.
Right.
And I came up with this idea about a rock drummer bicycling through Africa. And he comes to a village where they're known for their extra special drums. And it turns out that they make their drums with human skin, which is why they have such a special sound. And of course, panic and, bad things happen. And it's a very creepy, dark fantasy story. And we published that in the anthology, and I've reprinted it a couple of times. But Neil and I always talked about we should do it as a like a standalone book that has illustrations and all kinds of stuff in it. And I was busy, and we never really got around to it. And then Neil's health was fading. He died of brain cancer. And once he passed away, it just was like a shock to my system. And I went, damn it, we never got this book done. And I have my own publishing house. It's called Wordfire Press, and we published our 350 different titles already. And I thought, I have to do this. We have to come out with drum beats. And a Canadian artist, a well-known Canadian artist named Steve Otis, showed up on my Facebook page and said, hey, if you need any artwork for this, I would love to do a cover painting. And so he came on board and did a bunch of interior illustrations and did a cover painting. And we printed up 800 signed and numbered copies of drum beats. And I wrote a brand new introduction for it. Neil had written an afterword when we put it up as an ebook quite a few years ago, and that had never been in print before, his afterword. So we put his afterword and my introduction, all the illustrations and a bunch of photos and everything, and we put it out in an 800 copy signed and numbered edition, which sold out before the books even arrived. I mean, instantly sold out. So that was gone, and nobody could get another copy of it. So we've waited 6 months, and just last week we brought, I'm going to show it off here. We brought drum beats as a trade edition out. So this is not signed and numbered, but it's still got all the same stuff. Look at this, the beautiful cover. I don't know if you can see it or not.
Yes.
But it's drum beats, and it has, let's see if I can find one of the illustrations coming up with it. So there's beautiful like pen and pencil illustrations throughout. They're very creepy, and so that came out, and it's now just normal. You can buy it on Amazon or Wordfire Shop is where we have all of our signed books and stuff. But so that one, I'm just so pleased with it. Neil and I wrote it. He was so happy with the short story. I wish I had been able to get it done before he passed away. But
just going to add just a quick, just as a Rush fan myself, do you have a favorite Rush album or a favorite Rush song, or is it just kind of their collection?
Well, I mean, it's different songs for different things. Clockwork Angels, I worked with Neil to write the novel for Clockwork Angels. That's the last studio album by Rush. It's a steampunk fantasy adventure, a big concept album with the story all the way through it. Neil wrote the songs, and then we brainstormed the story together. Then I wrote the novel, and it came out. And that also made Neil a New York Times bestselling author. So that was pretty cool. So Clockwork Angels is very close to my heart. The last song on that album is called The Garden, and I think that's the best song they've ever done.
Wow.
And it's like the perfect thing to end their career on.
Great.
But Grace Under Pressure also is very close to me because it inspired my first novel. And But if we're going to talk about favorite Rush songs, we got another hour or something like that to go.
Oh, fair enough. All right. That was great. So now it's time for a special segment of our show where we spin the wheel. And what I've got for you, for those of you who don't know,
I can't wait. All right.
We have an actual wheel, and we've got 7 categories, some of which I picked out specifically just for you. And the categories are cigarette smoking man, stranger in a strange land, music lover, fear of flying, and hitchhiker's guide. I'm going to spin the wheel, and what you get is what you play. You ready?
All right.
All right. What do we got?
It's all a blur to me.
Well, I'll tell you here. You got music lover. Haha. Okay. So as it turns out, what song or piece of music do you love no matter how many times you hear it?
Well, I mean, the Grace Under Pressure album, like I said, I played it so many times. I've almost retired it because I just don't need to hear it anymore. And then I realized I got to play this again. And there's one song on there called The Enemy Within, which is just some of Neil's best lyrics he's ever written. It's not one of their big songs. I mean, they haven't played it in concert more than just one tour, I think. But it just resonates with me. It inspired so much of the novel Resurrection Inc. that every time I hear it, I wrote that book 34 years ago or something like that. And it's still playing those songs. It just all comes back to me about, I remember that scene and I remember writing this part. And so there we go.
All right. Good on you. All right. So Kevin, you and I are both in the writing business. So let's go to our advice column. What's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you or advice you overheard?
Well, the best advice is don't quit your day job because, I mean, this is a really volatile business. And even if it's sort of like becoming a musician. I recorded a song, so I'm going to quit my day job and hope that the record sales come pouring in. It just doesn't happen. And publishing is such a volatile field, and it changes all the time, that what worked last year doesn't necessarily work this year. So don't quit your day job if you have I didn't quit my technical writing job until I think I had 7 New York Times bestsellers and a year's worth of expenses in the bank, just because it's so uncertain. So that's good advice. Boy, there's a lot of bad advice out there. If you write a good book, it will magically be discovered by your readers. Well, no, it won't. There are millions and millions of titles out there, and if you just publish a book and put up the Kindle edition on your own, and you have a terrible cover and you don't promote it at all, and you expect, if you build it, they will come, that isn't going to happen. That's bad advice.
Agreed.
These days, if you're going to be a writer, you have to also wear all the hats. You can't just write a book and say, that's my part, somebody else needs to make it a hit. You've got to know the publishing business. You got to know marketing. You've got to do social media. You've got to do your editing and your cover design if you're going to be indie publishing it. And there's just so much that you need to know. So start now, start reading everything and putting it together.
All right, that's great. So Kevin, we got a couple minutes to take some questions. One of them that's been sitting in my queue and I wanted to ask you is, so you did a little writing some titles in the Predator franchise. What was that like?
Well, I did one comic series in Predator. I was working for Dark Horse Comics to do Star Wars comics. And I had this idea about what if you put a Predator fighting against a Kodiak, a big grizzly bear up in the wilds of Alaska. And then you put a forest ranger in the middle of that. And then you have a forest fire starting. And so I'm a big hiker. I do lots of stuff out in the national forest and stuff here. So I kind of drew upon my own stuff. But what was a challenge to this one, and it was me and the artist, it was 2 issues of the comics, and we wrote the entire comic with almost no words at all, because it's the Predator versus a grizzly bear. And so it's all visual, and it was, the bear's not going to talk and the Predator doesn't have to talk. So we just had very minimal stuff except for the forest ranger with that stuff in there. But I also wrote a short story for one of the Predator anthologies about predators fighting on an alien planet. There's a human colony set up, and they inadvertently get caught up in a predator war. So watching all those movies, I mean, doing the research is pretty cool.
All right.
I ain't got time to bleed. There's great stuff.
Nice. All right, Kevin. So this has been a great half hour. So before we wrap up, it's time for some shameless promotion. So we talked about drum beats, but you got a couple other things coming out. What do you got?
Sure. Well, we talked about the X-Files, and I've got this is a brand new book from about a month ago called Stake. And this is an idea that I originally conceived for my work at the X-Files, but I liked it too much that I just kept it to myself instead. And it's about a guy who absolutely believes in vampires. And so he thinks he's saving the world by tracking down people that only have night jobs. And he breaks into their apartment during the day and pounds a stake through their heart because he's going to kill vampires. And of course, is he a serial killer or is he an actual vampire hunter? And all that depends on whether or not vampires are real. And it's very, very much a conspiracy theory and what's real and fake news and what isn't. And I had a blast writing that one. It's something I've wanted to do for years, and that just came out. And then a week from yesterday, so it's October 13th, is my new Dune book with Brian Herbert, Dune, The Duke of Caladan. It's our first new Dune book in 4 or 5 years. And it tells it's about the year before Dune, how everything is all ramped up and sets up for right where Dune opens up. So that one's available for pre-order. Stake is out there and Drumbeats is out there. And what you can get a lot of these. We have our own stock web store. It's called wordfireshop.com. And there's a whole bunch of signed books there. We all sell them just for cover price and things if we want an autograph. So
all right. All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. This is for a great show. And I want to thank everyone who's watching. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro. And since we've been talking about sci-fi and fantasy, it just so happens, if you're a fan of space opera, I have my own Crossline, if you can see it here, about a modern day space pilot thrust into a parallel Earth caught between rebellion, Armageddon, and a desperate fight to get home. And if sci-fi mystery is more your game, hot off the presses, Crackle and Fire, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, who was hired to find a missing intern with stolen corporate files, but soon finds herself tackling with dueling gangsters, angry protesters, and a madman from Earth with galactic ambitions of his own. They're both available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and I'll see you guys next week.